A cold-hearted CEO millionaire unexpectedly reunites with his first love, only to find she's now a homeless woman wandering the streets with 2 young children. He reaches out to help, unaware that behind this fateful encounter lie buried secrets, a painful past, and a chance at a second love, marked by trials and turbulence. Ethan Sullivan walked slowly through the bustling street, his sharp, cold eyes scanning the throng of people. In his hand was an expensive phone, but his mind was submerged in the numbers of an upcoming $1 million deal. For this man, the world was a harsh game, a place where only the strong survived. But then, an unexpected sight caught his attention. At the street corner, beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, a woman sat huddled on the cold pavement. Her tattered clothes couldn't hide her frail, exhausted frame. Her once lustrous hair was now a tangled mess, falling over a face grayed by street dust. 2 twin children, about 4 years old, clung to her like frightened baby birds. One little girl sobbed uncontrollably, her tiny hands rubbing her eyes, while the other remained silent, staring at the world with wide, bewildered eyes full of confusion. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He recognized her. Claire Anderson, the silent love of his high school years, the radiant girl who had once been an unreachable dream, the one who walked across the school courtyard with a dazzling smile, one that was never meant for him. Not even a fleeting glance of kindness. But now, there she sat, filthy, impoverished, and utterly broken. A chill crept up Ethan's spine. Part of him wanted to walk away. She had never cared for him. Why should he bother? But then Claire's trembling voice pierced the air, striking his heart like a whisper-turned dagger. "Don't cry, my love. Mommy will figure something out. Someone will help us." That voice, no longer proud, no longer vibrant, only exhaustion remained, as if she'd been fighting for so long that hope had slipped away entirely. Ethan clenched his fist. He couldn't walk away. "Claire?" His voice was soft like a breeze, yet it rang out like thunder in the quiet night. Claire looked up. Her gray-blue eyes widened in shock. For a fleeting moment they simply stared at each other. Perhaps in that instant all the old memories neither dared to speak of lingered between them. Then she lowered her head, as if wishing to vanish. What happened?" Ethan's voice dropped, laced with disbelief and a pang of sorrow he hadn't expected. Claire shook her head, clutching her children tighter. "Go away, Ethan. Don't get involved in my life." But Ethan couldn't. Not when one of the children was hiccuping from hunger, not when the other trembled in the biting cold of the night. "You're not okay, Claire." He met her gaze directly. "And I'm not going anywhere." Claire shook her head furiously. "I don't need your pity." "It's not pity." Ethan's tone deepened, resolute. "I'm going to help you." She fell silent, gripping her children's hands tightly, but in her bewildered eyes flickered a trace of hope. Small, fragile. Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed quickly. "James, get to 5th Street, Oak Corner. I need the car here in 5 minutes." He hung up, then extended a hand toward Claire. "Get up." Claire bit her lip, visibly torn, but when she looked down at her daughters, one growing limp with exhaustion in her arms, the other struggling to stifle her tears to spare her mother's feelings, she knew she had no other choice. Her trembling hand touched his. Ethan gripped it firmly, like a promise. When the car arrived, he lifted one child into his arms, while Claire held the other. They climbed in, leaving the dark street behind. On the drive, Claire stared out the window, her eyes vacant, while Ethan occasionally glanced at her through the rearview mirror. He couldn't guess what she was thinking, but one thing he knew for certain: this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The night had grown late. Ethan Sullivan's sprawling mansion was steeped in a silence broken only by the whistling wind slipping through the window panes. Under the soft glow of a wall lamp, Claire Anderson sat quietly on a chair by the living room window, her gaze fixed on the star-filled sky beyond. But she wasn't really looking at the sky. She was peering into her past. A past she didn't want to remember, but couldn't escape. Ethan descended the stairs, intending to grab a glass of water, when he paused abruptly upon seeing Claire's small figure sitting there. She was curled up, her slender hands clutching a thin blanket as though it were her last shield against the storms raging within her. Something in Ethan urged him to step closer. "Can't sleep?" His voice, warm and steady, broke the silence between them. Claire flinched, turning her head. For a moment she resembled a frightened bird, her eyes brimming with unease. But then she shook her head slightly, trying to bury the emotions swelling inside her. "It's just, I'm not used to this peace." She gave a faint smile, but her eyes were shadowed with darkness. Ethan sat down in the chair across from her, quietly observing. "Claire," he said gently but firmly, "tell me what happened." She fell silent, her gaze wavering. She knew Ethan wasn't the type to be easily brushed off, but her heart still bore too many scars to open up without resistance. "I don't want to talk about it," she murmured, her voice so soft it seemed louder words might shatter her, letting those memories flood out and consume her. Ethan didn't press her, but he didn't leave either. He simply sat there, waiting, and it was that patience that slowly chipped away at Claire's defenses. After a while she let out a shaky breath, her eyes drifting into the distance. "I used to think I had everything," she said, her voice light but laced with bitterness. Ethan remained still, listening intently. "After high school I started dating Jason Miller. He was the perfect guy in everyone's eyes. Handsome, charming, smart. I loved him so much I believed the world revolved around our love." Claire gave a faint, bitter laugh, her eyes glinting with regret. "And then I got pregnant." Ethan held his breath. He could have guessed as much, but hearing it from Claire herself made his chest tighten. "When I told Jason, I thought he'd pull me into his arms, tell me everything would be okay, that we'd raise these kids together." She let out a pained chuckle. "But do you know what he did, Ethan?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to guess. He looked at me like I was a burden. Then he said he wasn't ready to be a father, that I was ruining both our futures. Claire swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "He left, vanished from my life like I'd never existed." Ethan's fists clenched. A quiet anger simmered within him, but he held it back. "I went through the pregnancy alone, endured it all by myself," Claire continued, her gaze growing distant. "Back then, I didn't think I could do it. I panicked, cried until I had no tears left. But I couldn't give up, because of Harper and Hazel." At that, tears slipped down Claire's cheeks. "I tried everything to provide for them. But a single mother with no degree, no family to lean on, what chance did I have?" Her voice cracked. "I worked myself to the bone day after day, but the money was never enough. When Harper and Hazel were 2, I got evicted from my apartment because I couldn't pay the rent. And from then on..." She fell silent. But Ethan knew the rest. She'd ended up on the streets, pushed into society's darkest corners where no one cared about a mother with 2 small children. A dull ache spread through Ethan's chest. He'd once thought he was the one who'd suffered most when Claire never noticed him in high school, but now, looking into her weary, wounded eyes, he realized she'd borne far more than he ever had. "Claire," he began, but she shook her head. "Don't give me your pity, Ethan," she said sharply, though beneath her tone was a fragile veneer. Ethan took a deep breath. "I'm not pitying you. I'm angry." Claire blinked, startled, and looked at him. "I'm angry that you had to go through it all alone. Angry that the guy who abandoned you gets to live carefree while you carry the consequences. And angry because..." He paused, his eyes brimming with emotion. "Because you never came to me." Claire blinked again, as if his words had struck a part of her she hadn't dared acknowledge. "Why didn't you find me, Claire?" Ethan's voice softened, heavy with longing. "Why did you choose to be alone?" Claire bit her lip, her gaze faltering. Finally she sighed. "Because I was ashamed, Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want anyone to see me like that, especially you." Ethan froze. Claire lowered her head, her hands gripping each other tightly. "I didn't want you to see me like this." I didn't want you to watch me go from a proud girl to a poor, exhausted, desperate woman." A heavy silence settled over them. Slowly, Ethan reached out, gently placing his hand over Claire's trembling one. "But now, I've seen you," he said softly, "and I'm not going anywhere." Claire looked up at him, her eyes shimmering in the dim light, and for the first time in years, she felt she wasn't alone. Ethan Sullivan had never been one to meddle in other people's affairs, but this time he couldn't stand idly by. After the tear-soaked conversation with Claire the previous night, he'd made up his mind to act. Not because he felt obligated to protect her, but because he couldn't stomach the thought of a man like Jason Miller living a carefree life while Claire had endured hell. Jason needed to know, and Ethan would make him understand that every choice comes with a price. The fated encounter finding Jason was easier than Ethan had expected. It wasn't surprising that a man like him still lived lavishly, frequently appearing in financial magazines as a successful businessman. Tonight he was dining at an upscale restaurant in Manhattan, where dazzling chandeliers cast their light onto tables draped in pristine white linens. Ethan didn't bother making a reservation. He didn't need to. As he entered, his presence immediately drew eyes from the restaurant's patrons. A man with a chilling aura, walking slowly, yet with undeniable authority. He didn't need to speak to silence the room. He spotted Jason right away. The man sat at a luxurious corner table, smirking as he chatted with a glamorous blonde woman. He swirled a glass of wine in his hand, his eyes gleaming with smug satisfaction. Ethan approached without hesitation. Jason looked up, his cold blue eyes narrowing as he recognized the man standing before him. "Sullivan? What? Surprised to see you here. Did we have an appointment?" Ethan ignored the feigned politeness. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his gaze locked on Jason. "We need to talk." Jason raised an eyebrow, feigning amusement. "I don't recall us having anything to discuss." Ethan gave a faint, icy smile. "About Claire. Is she doing all right? I assume she's latched onto someone by now, otherwise she wouldn't have survived this long." The disdain in Jason's voice ignited a fire in Ethan. He leaned forward, his voice low but laced with danger. "She's fought to survive. And you? Still enjoying your unburdened life, I see." Jason shrugged, offering a weak smirk. "Don't act so noble, Sullivan. Claire made her choice and I made mine. She wanted to keep the kid. That was her decision, not mine." Ethan's fists clenched, his knuckles whitening. "The kid," he repeated, his tone dripping with contempt. "Did you know you have 2 daughters?" This time Jason seemed genuinely caught off guard, but instead of showing remorse, he laughed, a hollow, mocking sound as if it were some absurd joke. "2, huh? Well, that's interesting news." He shrugged again. "But as I said, it's got nothing to do with me." Ethan shot to his feet. The surrounding diners turned to look, but he didn't care. All he could think about was Claire. How much she'd suffered over the years while this bastard didn't even spare a thought for his own children. "You don't feel any guilt?" Ethan's voice was sharp, each word cutting like a blade. Jason smirked, his eyes devoid of regret. "Guilt? No. I made it clear from the start that I didn't want to be tied down. She knew that, but she kept the baby anyway. That's her problem, not mine." His words hit Ethan like a dagger. "You're a coward, Miller," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "And I'm damn glad Claire and her daughters have nothing to do with you anymore." Jason's lips curled into a challenging grin. "Then why are you here? To vent on her behalf, or do you think you can change something?" Ethan stared him down, his eyes like cold steel. "No. I'm here to let you know one thing." He leaned closer, his voice a menacing whisper. "Claire doesn't need you. Your kids don't need you, and I'll make sure your name never crosses their lives again." Jason chuckled softly, but something in Ethan's gaze made him shiver. Ethan straightened up, buttoned his suit jacket with precision, and walked away from the table without a backward glance. He didn't need Jason's response. because the man had nothing worth saying. But as he stepped out of the restaurant, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He would do everything in his power to ensure Claire and her daughters never suffered another wound from that heartless man. And perhaps, deep in his heart, Ethan realized he wasn't just protecting Claire out of compassion. It was because he loved her. The sunset stretched across the city sky, painting a vibrant orange hue over the glass windows of the Sullivan mansion. Inside, Claire stood before a mirror, looking off calmly, smoothing out the simple yet elegant dress she'd chosen for dinner with Ethan. Since she and her daughters had arrived here, she'd never felt such relief. The long, cold nights were gone. Harper and Hazel laughed more often, and deep within, Claire was beginning to learn to believe she deserved a better life. And Ethan was patient, always by her side whenever she hesitated to take a step forward. He showed her that life wasn't just about survival. It could also be moments of peace, genuine care without expectation. But just as Claire started to believe in that, doubt crept back in. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown sender. Claire frowned and opened it. "Are you sure he really cares about you, or is it just a game?" Below the text was a photo. Ethan sitting in a luxurious restaurant across from a beautiful woman. She wore a fitted black dress, her eyes seductive, and they appeared to be engaged in an intimate conversation. Claire's heart sank. She stared at the image, her chest heavy. This feeling, the sting of betrayal, the sensation of the ground crumbling beneath her, was all too familiar. But this time it was worse, because it involved Ethan, the man she'd begun to trust, the man she, perhaps, had come to love. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the phone. Part of her wanted to dismiss it, to believe it was a misunderstanding. But another, the part that had been abandoned, betrayed, whispered that she was stepping into a path she couldn't control. She'd trusted Jason once, and he'd left her the moment she needed him most. What guaranteed Ethan wouldn't do the same? The confrontation dinner took place in the spacious dining room, but Claire no longer felt the warmth she usually did. Ethan noticed the change almost immediately. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes filled with concern. Claire took a deep breath and set her cutlery down. "Who did you meet last night?" she asked bluntly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Ethan paused briefly. "Last night?" "Yes." Claire slowly pulled out her phone, placed it on the table, and turned the screen toward him. "I got this message." Ethan looked at the photo. His eyes turned cold for a moment, but then he met her gaze, unwavering. "It was a business meeting. She's a financial advisor the company is considering working with," he said calmly, without a hint of hesitation or unease. But Claire couldn't accept that answer so easily. "Then why would someone send me this?" she asked, her voice catching. "Why would someone want me? To doubt you?" Ethan fell silent for a moment. He looked deep into her eyes, then stood, walked around the table, and sat beside her. "I don't know who sent that message," he said, his tone low and serious. "But what I do know is that I have nothing to hide from you, Claire. If you want, I'll show you all my work messages. I'll call that woman right now so you can hear her confirm it herself." Claire stared at him, her heart torn. "You can say that, Ethan," she said with a faint, bitter smile. "But what I'm afraid of isn't a message or a photo. What I'm afraid of is myself." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Claire lowered her head, clenching her hands together. "I trusted someone before, and he abandoned me without a second thought. Jason isn't me," Ethan said, his voice sharpening. "But how do I know that for sure?" Claire looked up, her eyes gleaming with a fear Ethan had never seen before. "How do I know that one day, when I've fully trusted you, you won't do the same?" Ethan gazed at her, his heart aching. He knew how deeply Claire had been hurt, but he hadn't realized those scars were still bleeding, even now. He gently reached out and took her hand. "You don't know," he said slowly, "but I'll spend my life proving to you that you can trust me." Claire looked at him, And in that moment, she wanted to believe him more than anything in the world. But trust wasn't something that could be built in a single night, and the ghosts of her past weren't ready to let go. The truth revealed. The next day, Ethan immediately launched an investigation into the mysterious message's source. Within a few hours, he had his answer. It had been sent by a former employee fired from his company months ago, a bitter individual seeking to tarnish his reputation. Ethan presented the evidence to Claire. She read through the messages, the details about the sender, then slowly looked up at him. "You didn't lie," she whispered. Ethan crossed his arms, watching her intently. "I told you I have nothing to hide." A quiet shame welled up inside Claire. "I'm sorry," she said softly, but loud enough for Ethan to hear, "for doubting you." He shook his head and stepped closer, gently placing his hands on her shoulders. "I know you've been hurt too much," he said, his voice softer than ever. "I'd never force you to trust me right away, but I want you to know I'll always be here, no matter how many times you doubt me." Claire looked at him, her heart swelling with emotions she'd never dared to touch before. For the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she could trust again. The morning at the Sullivan mansion was bathed in gentle sunlight, but within Claire's heart a storm still raged, one that had never fully subsided. She stood by the bedroom window, gazing down at the garden where Harper and Hazel played with wildflowers. The two children giggled, utterly carefree, as if the world had never brought them any pain. But Claire knew they had endured far too much, and she, their only mother, had been wounded too deeply. Memories of Jason, of the days of abandonment, of the long nights clutching her children as they slept on cold sidewalks. They lingered, a wound that refused to heal. Ethan had done everything to help her rise again, to show her she no longer had to fight alone. But there was one thing he couldn't do for her: let go of the past. That was something only she could do. And she knew the time had come. Facing the past. "Are you sure you should go alone?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with concern as he watched Claire slip on a light jacket, preparing to leave. She smiled, a small but resolute smile. "This is something I need to finish on my own." Ethan studied her, his eyes full of understanding. He didn't want to push her, nor did he want her to face it alone, but he knew this was a step she had to take by herself. "If anything happens, call me right away," he said, his hand gently squeezing hers. Claire nodded, feeling the familiar warmth of his touch. Then she left. Jason Miller was exactly as Claire remembered him, except now he seemed smaller. He sat alone in the corner of a coffee shop, a cold cup of coffee in front of him. When Claire walked in, he looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before it settled back into indifference. "Claire, it's been a while." She pulled out a chair and sat down, keeping her voice steady. "It has." Jason took a sip of his coffee and gave a faint smirk. "I didn't think you'd come looking for me after all these years." "Neither did I," Claire replied, her eyes no longer carrying the vulnerability they once did. Jason shrugged. "So, what are you here for? To blame me? To make me take responsibility?" Claire looked at him, and as a cold breeze brushed past, she realized something. She no longer hated him. There was no more anger, no more pain when she thought of him. All that remained was emptiness. "No," she said, her voice light as a breeze. "I'm here to tell you I don't expect anything from you anymore." Jason raised an eyebrow, as if he'd never imagined she'd say such a thing. "You don't affect my life or my children's lives anymore," Claire continued, her gaze unwavering. "Harper and Hazel don't need you. I don't need you." Jason smirked faintly. "Then why bother coming here?" Claire took a deep breath. "To close the final door to my past." He fell silent for a moment, then shrugged. "If that's what you want." Claire stood up, giving him one last look. "I used to think that if I ever faced you again, I'd blame you, ask why you abandoned us. But now, I realize it doesn't matter anymore. The past no longer defines me." She turned and walked away. and for the first time in years, Claire felt her heart lighten, embracing. From the future, when Claire returned to the mansion, the sunset had begun to fall, casting a golden glow over the pristine white walls. Ethan stood in the garden, Harper and Hazel chattering beside him. Their tiny hands tugged at his clothes, pointing excitedly at the vibrant flowers. The sight was so beautiful it took Claire's breath away. Ethan turned, catching her gaze. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice warm and steady, like an anchor. Claire stepped closer and nodded. "Yes, I've ended it all." Ethan studied her carefully, as if ensuring she was truly all right. Then he held out his hand. Without a moment's hesitation, Claire placed her hand in his. Harper and Hazel ran over, wrapping their arms around their mother, their laughter filling the late afternoon air. And Claire knew at last she had truly stepped out of the shadows of her past. No more fear, no more pain, only love, hope, and a future she knew she could trust. Claire had never imagined she'd wake up one day feeling such profound peace. The sun cast gentle rays through the window, bathing the room in a warm glow. Harper and Hazel were still curled up in their blankets, two little angels with innocent faces free of worry. Claire lightly brushed her daughter's soft hair, her heart swelling with love. Everything had changed. No more cold, endless nights on the sidewalk. No more lonely, fearful days. She was no longer the abandoned woman, the desperate mother uncertain of tomorrow. She was Claire Anderson, a strong woman, a resilient mother, and most importantly, the woman Ethan Sullivan loved. An unexpected proposal that day. Ethan took Claire and the girls to a small farm on the outskirts of town, where fields stretched endlessly under a deep blue sky. Harper and Hazel ran gleefully through the grass, chattering as they explored new wonders. Claire watched from a distance, her heart softening at the sight before her. Ethan, with a gentle smile, kneeling to tie Hazel's shoelaces while Harper babbled about a butterfly she'd just spotted. It felt strangely familiar, as if they'd been a family for a long, long time. Ethan stood and walked over to Claire, his gaze tender yet resolute. "I've prepared something special for today," he said, his voice warm like a promise. Claire blinked. "What is it?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he gently pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and knelt before her. Time seemed to stop. Harper and Hazel paused their play, looking curiously at their mother and Ethan. Claire's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening as her heart raced. "Claire Anderson," Ethan began, his voice steady, though his deep green eyes shimmered with an ocean of emotion. "From the moment I saw you again, I knew I'd never let you face this world alone. You're the strongest woman I've ever known. You fought for your children, for yourself. And now, I want to be part of your life, forever." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, but this time, they didn't carry the bitterness of pain. "I love you, Claire. I love Harper and Hazel as if they were my own, and I want to spend the rest of my life protecting the three of you." He opened the box, revealing a sparkling diamond ring, but Claire barely saw it. All she saw was Ethan, the man who'd stood by her in her weakest moments, who'd helped her believe in love again, and she knew there was no room left for doubt. "Yes!" Harper and Hazel squealed with delight as Ethan slid the ring onto Claire's finger, then pulled all three of them into a tight embrace. For the first time in her life, Claire felt she truly had a home, a new beginning. The months that followed passed more quickly than Claire could have imagined. Their wedding took place in a small garden, with Harper and Hazel as the most adorable flower girls she'd ever seen. She didn't need an extravagant ceremony or hundreds of guests, just the people who genuinely loved her by her side, and Ethan, her lifelong partner, stood there, waiting for her to walk toward him. After the wedding, Claire embarked on a new journey. With Ethan's support, she enrolled in business courses, step by step building a career she'd never thought possible. Beyond that, Ethan offered her a position at his company, not out of pity, but because he believed in her. "I want you to do this not just for yourself, but for Harper and Hazel," he said. "Show them their mother can do anything." Claire looked at him, and for the first time she saw a different version of herself. A woman no longer afraid of her past, but crafting a brighter future. A miracle, their lives soon settled into a rhythm of happiness. Claire could hardly believe that just a year ago, she'd been wandering the streets with her daughters. But then, an unexpected piece of news turned their world upside down once more. This time in a miraculous way. Claire stood in the bathroom, her eyes fixed on the pregnancy test in her hand. 2 lines. She placed a hand on her stomach, her heart pounding with excitement. How would Ethan react when he learned they were expecting another little one? When she stepped into the living room, Ethan was reading the newspaper, surrounded by Harper and Hazel, who were chattering about some fairy tale. Claire smiled softly. She walked over, sat beside him, and gently placed her hand on his. "Ethan," she whispered. He turned to her, smiling. "What is it, love?" Claire bit her lip, then handed him the pregnancy test. The moment he realized what it was, his eyes widened. He looked at her, then back at the test, as if he couldn't believe it. You're saying—" Claire nodded, tears glistening in the lamplight. "We're having a baby, Ethan." For a moment, Ethan was speechless. Then he pulled her into a tight embrace, his smile wider than ever. Harper and Hazel jumped up in excitement when they learned they'd soon have a little sibling, and Claire knew this was the happiness she'd never dared to dream of. A new life, a true family. And this time, she wasn't afraid anymore.